Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Inglenook, a show about some of history's greatest stories. I'm your host, Logan Istre. Today, we're combining biography and classic literature in our discussion of a man whose work contributed to the emergence of horror, science fiction, detective mysteries, and gothic fiction in general, Edgar Allan Poe. Poe remains one of the most famous writers in American history, owing both to the timeless allure of his macabre stories and the dark, tragic, and short nature of his own life. Impressive for a man who only lived to age 40, the mystique of Poe's life keeps us coming back for more. My guest today is one of the best qualified scholars to help us understand Poe's life and work. J. Gerald Kennedy is Boyd Professor Emeritus of English at Louisiana State University, my alma mater, where he has taught for decades. He is an authority on American literature broadly and Edgar Allan Poe in particular, with an extensive publication record spanning numerous books and edited volumes, which include The Portable Edgar Allan Poe, Strange Nation, Literary Nationalism of the Age of Poe, and the Oxford Handbook of Edgar Allan Poe. A link to some of his leading Poe publications will be in the description below. Dr. Kennedy is especially familiar with Poe's place in American literary history, and it's an honor to speak with him today. Jerry, it's great to have you. How are you?
I'm doing okay, Logan.
Good. Well, the way I like to sort of start these conversations is to get to know a little bit about what drew you to the topic and what keeps you engaged. Obviously, from your shirt and everything around you, you're a Poe guy. Um,
Yeah.
and so what got you studying English? How do you approach the study of English, but with a special focus on Poe? What got you there?
Well, I've told this story in other places, and it's a little bit embarrassing, but I'll tell it again anyway. Uh, when I was in seventh grade, um, we had a thing called the Tab Book Club, where you get a little flyer put out by this company that supplies cheap paperback editions to junior high and high school students. And you have an opportunity to order books, blah, blah, blah. Bring in your $2 or whatever it is, and you send off, and eventually it comes and the teacher passes out the books that people have ordered. Well, I spotted this book I thought I had to have. It was Poe, Tales of Mystery and Imagination. It was a really, I think there were 10 tales in this cheapo little paperback, which I still have. And I started reading them, and I was just absolutely floored by how uh, how gripping they were, how they kind of took over my consciousness, my attention, and I found it so provocative that I started to look for Poe and started reading his work. And one other thing that I did that year, which is this is sort of the embarrassing side of it, was that in February, my grandfather came home from Florida. He had just been diagnosed with terminal colon cancer, and he and my grandmother, who was a nurse, had set up their living room so that he could have a hospital bed and people could come in and visit. And, with all of the incredible sensitivity of an adolescent male, about 13, 14 years old, I asked my grandfather if he wanted to borrow my edition of Poe's Tales. I had not quite reached the tale that now seems just such a kind of bad decision on my part, and that is the facts in the case of Monsieur Valdemar, which is an amazing. Actually, it's something of a literary hoax, but Poe creates the sense of a medical experiment which is taking place in New York involving a man who was dying of tuberculosis. And this was the great age of mesmerism, the advent of what we now call hypnotism. And there was a lot of interest in this subject all over the country and indeed across the pond as well. Many of the writers of that day were, writing little pieces or novels or stories that incorporated mesmerism. Anyway, the experiment here is that they were going to mesmerize Valdemar at the very point of death to see if that process could be suspended indefinitely by the hypnotic trance. And Poe's narrator, who's a very dutiful guy, obviously a scientific type, describes the whole process, describes the physical phenomena that he observes, which is the gauntness of Valdemar and the yellowish liquid that comes out of his eyes, et cetera, et cetera. Anyway, this was the brilliant thing that I gave to my grandfather to read. It's about a guy who stays in a hypnotic trance for about 8 months until somehow he summons this will to be released. He wants to die, he tells them. And they eventually take him out of his mesmeric trance, at which point Valdemar decomposes in a matter of 30 seconds into a disgusting mass of what Poe calls loathsome putrescence. Yeah, so I handed that to my grandfather, and little did I realize I hadn't finished the whole volume. See, so there's a mistake. This is one of the first big mistakes I made in my career as a Poe nut, was not finishing the book, and that has kind of haunted me ever since. I got the book back from my grandfather, who died in August, and it was for me, a very hard thing to metabolize. This was the first member of my family, a close relative who had died, and it had a big impact. And I think I was doing what a lot of teenagers do. I was just in denial and trying to make little jokes to myself and, going about my life as if nothing else was happening. And yet, in ways that I really didn't begin to think about much until college or grad school. Poe, the fascination for me with Poe is the way that he opens up the problem of death, the existential dilemma we face as human beings. We're all going to die, like it or not. And so much of Poe's work is obsessed with the process of dying or coming back from the dead or somehow crossing the veil. One of his first really great tales was Manuscript Found in a Bottle. And there Poe describes a character who is on a ship. I should say he has fallen off one ship and landed on another ship, which seems to be manned by ghosts, by phantoms. And the ship is hurtling along in some kind of powerful current. And the narrator gradually becomes aware that he is bound for destruction. The ship is headed for a vortex at the South Pole. This was a very popular theory in Poe's time, sponsored by a guy named Sims, Symmes. And Poe absolutely bought it. And he used it not only in that story, but in his novel, The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym. But in Manuscript Found in a Bottle, it really gives us kind of a template, a trademark for, or a brand, if you will, for the whole body of work that Poe would subsequently produce, because it's a man who is approaching death and knows he is and wants to keep writing so that he can communicate uh, the supposedly never to be imparted secret whose attainment is destruction. So this idea of writing across into the abyss becomes a compelling idea in Poe, almost from the beginning. And it really runs through the whole, the whole body of work that he produced, surfaces again and again. And in the project that I'm working on right now, which is a cultural biography of Poe, um, I'm I'm constantly reminded of how much Poe is an inhabitant of the early to mid 19th century in a culture that is absolutely gripped by this conflict between science and religion, between an empirical view of life that resists any sort of spiritual, supernatural explanation of existence, and a more traditional Christian religious view of life that is struggling in the face of secularism that is sweeping the country, and the rise of all kinds of new scientific projects that seem to undercut the notion of biblical history. I mean, this was the age of geology, and we aren't quite to Darwin and the origin of species, but there were so many works emerging from science. And of course, Poe was absolutely caught up in it. And it ultimately led him to his great, inscrutable prose poem, which he called Eureka, his attempt to unravel the mystery of the cosmos. Just a humble little project that he took on.
Well, I want so let me. I was going to ask you after how you got interested in Poe, what keeps you interested in Poe after all these years, and you've answered that and even more, and you've got me much more locked into the topic than I originally was, and you've so I want to as Poe sits at this sort of crossroads of meaning, where the sort of traditional society with explanations for life after death and the meaning of it all is sort of starting to crumble in a more rationalistic, empirical type space. And you have this romanticism, I guess, as a response in the early 1800s. If we can just take some time to situate Poe in his space and then jump into what he's doing in these works, because that's obviously, uh, we could spend probably 5 hours talking about just,
Yeah,
Arthur
yeah.
Gordon Pym. But what about Poe's back? So from his birth and sort of early life, and then going forward, because he has a really tragic sort of
Yeah,
life,
it does.
which is, and so what about his early life starts to shape Poe's experience of the world?
Well, yeah, I guess most people are familiar with the fact that Poe was an orphan, that his parents both died before he was 3 years old. His father just disappeared sometime when Poe was two, and his mother, uh, who took care of him until she no longer could, um, died in December of 1811 in Richmond of tuberculosis. That you know great killer of many many Americans and Brits and people around the world. It was the cancer of the 19th century in terms of being the big killer that people talked about and read about and worried about. So Poe was taken in by a Richmond couple, John Allan and his wife, and this was right after, actually during the War of 1812. They made the decision to to actually it was slightly before the War of 1812. They made the decision to take Poe in. This was, yeah, he was baptized at the very end of 1811. And by 1815, John Allan decided that he would move the family to London because he ran a business with a man named Charles Ellis, and their great sort of shtick was to take prime Virginia tobacco and sell it on the London market. And they were making big money. They were using a lot of that money to invest in manufactured domestic goods, which they brought back. They imported to Virginia and sold out of the store that Ellis and Allan and Ellis ran. But during these 5 years in England, Poe's experience, I think, really had a profound effect on his later life. One of the strange and entirely overlooked aspects of Poe biography is the fact that from 1815 until the middle of 1820, when Poe was not in school, he was living in John Allan's apartment on Southampton Row in London, which, if you know that neighborhood at all, and this is the Bloomsbury neighborhood, later made famous by Virginia Woolf and others, Poe was living literally 7 minutes by foot from the British Museum, which was open free to the public several days, several afternoons a week. And there are many, many fascinating descriptions in Poe that I think can be traced back to the British Museum. There's a description in the story Ligeia of a black sarcophagus, an Egyptian sarcophagus. And in the British Museum, Poe was introduced to Pacific Island culture. He was introduced to all kinds of gems and minerals. He was introduced to birds of the world. And he was certainly introduced in a major way to the art, and particularly the sculptural, the material art of Greece, Rome, and Egypt. And there, I think, he became absolutely fascinated by mummies. They had a few, not the huge array of mummies that the British Museum now has, but they had many. And just to put this in historical context, Poe moved there in 1815. In 1817, there was a big event connected with the British Museum. They put on display for the very first time the Elgin marbles from Athens. It created a sensation. Everybody wanted to go. Um, and of course, it ultimately inspired a poem by Keats and a satirical nod by Lord Byron in Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. Uh, but this was the world that Poe was living in, and he was fascinated by the cemeteries of London. He visited the tower where executions had taken place, and he was introduced to Anglican catechism and compelled to uh, absorb a ton of, you know, material that forced him to think about hell and eternal damnation and the sufferings of the body. And so this was the beginning of this uh, uh,
And he
turn.
and he would have been, an adolescent, early teenager, like 9 to 12,
Yeah,
something like that.
yeah. He was living in England from ages actually 6 to 11,
Okay.
but he was a very precocious
I
boy.
could tell.
Well, I mean, he was reading newspapers aloud to visitors at White Sulphur Springs when he was 3 years old. I mean, John Allen would put him up on a chair and have him pick up the newspaper and read it to dazzle all the guests.
And John
Uh,
Allen was fabulously wealthy, right?
well, not then.
Okay.
He became fabulously wealthy in 1825, but then they had their ups and downs.
Right.
When they all went off to London, the company was doing very well. The business was doing well, but they had to make the decision in 1819 to close down that London office. Why? Because the British had reestablished trade relations with France, and France could supply them with tobacco too. And suddenly, sending this Virginia tobacco across the ocean became far less profitable. And so, for a number of years in Richmond, and of course, in the United States, there was a big economic turndown in 1819. And the state that was most powerfully impacted by it was Virginia. So this was a very tough time, and they struggled to stay on their feet. And even in 1822, they were still trying to pay off debts that they owed to London suppliers. So,
Well, and I wonder, actually, it had almost slipped my mind. How did the War of 1812 affect the company's presence in England?
well, it was actually a bonanza because, when the British finally signed the Treaty of Ghent, the relations between the two countries resumed and trade resumed. And, England was still pretty well isolated from France, which would have been,
Right.
one of their obvious big trading partners in Europe. And so there was a real opportunity for Americans to rush in and create really profitable arrangements with London merchants. And, Allen and his partners saw that opportunity. This is, what's sometimes called the era of good feelings. Uh, and so the Brits, uh, continued to be very sarcastic about American culture and to talk about how crude and unrefined everybody in the States was. But there was a certain rapprochement, and for Poe living in England, it was a very exciting experience. Although I will say that I think he did his best to minimize his American identity. I think he probably developed a bit of a British accent pretty quickly, and tried to blend in with all of the other lads at either the Dubourg's school in Chelsea or uh, um, the school in Stoke Newington that he went to in 18 from 1818 onward until he left. This is Reverend Bransby School, famously depicted in the story William Wilson, which really evokes the feeling of alienation that Poe felt in England as a schoolboy. It's a great story to read.
Thank you. No, that's awesome. So
I recommend it thoroughly. No, it's a wonderful story, and it will be a very familiar one because the theme of the doppelganger, the double, is one that runs through Romantic literature on into the 20th and 21st centuries, and so William Wilson gets to this, very elite boarding school, and is put off by the fact that there's another boy there, not very popular and not very wealthy boy, who has the same name and the same birthday. And he has the annoying habit of telling on the narrator when he does something wrong. So anyway, you can see how that
yeah.
shapes up. And if you read that story, with some sensitivity to how Poe must have felt being, this is a little bit like Fitzgerald, but being the poorest boy at a rich boys' school, surrounded by lads who are going to go off to Oxford and Cambridge. And here's Poe, whose father is a merchant from the United States.
So he's kind of weird in the sense that he develops this very transatlantic sensibility. He's part of this English world of letters and learning, at least as a young man. And
Yes.
I was curious about his accent since I think he's born in New England, as an infant, lives in Virginia, but will be in Baltimore, Pennsylvania, later, New York as well. And so I always wondered what he actually sounded like as a
Oh,
person.
I think he had I think he had a slightly affected English accent when he came back that gradually didn't disappear entirely, but he certainly had a kind of tidewater about, that I think that would have been, that could have been the only sort of vernacular that he
Right,
absorbed, because he was not in Boston long enough,
right.
to pick that up, and nor was he long enough, and he, you know, he got to the other places you mentioned much later in life after his way of speaking had been very well set. So,
So So is it fair
no,
to say that
uh,
he comes back with something of a chip on his shoulder, that he's exposed to this world of learning and culture, but by being, an adopted American son of, adopted son of a merchant, is not a full member of that community?
yeah, I would make this distinction. Uh, Poe was never adopted, and this was a very sore spot. He was a foster child who was taken in by John Allan and his wife Frances, and they baptized him and gave him a middle name, which he didn't have, and called him Allan. But one of the reasons that I am dropping that middle name in the book I'm writing is that Poe hated it. And in 1827, when John Allan sort of definitively kicked him out, and told him that he could no longer live in the mansion, Moldavia, uh, Poe realized that he had to get out of town, literally. There were people from Charlottesville he owed money to, and they were following him around. there were paid bill collectors who were showing up at John Allen's house. I mean, he had racked up a lot of debts in Charlottesville, and so uh, Poe, realized in 1827 that that dream of becoming part of the landed gentry and living in the big house and having servants, yeah, slaves, uh, was over. And so he made up a name. He called himself Henri Le Rene, uh, which you have a French name, so you may appreciate it's a pun on renaître, to be reborn. Uh, Henri Le Rene.
I'm just imagining a waifish, 21-year-old literary guy calling himself by a French name with an effective or
Well,
affected
he
English
didn't use
accent.
it very long. He
Okay.
he used it in Richmond for a couple of weeks because he was trying to avoid a bailiff who wanted to serve him a warrant. he was he was vulnerable to being arrested. Uh, I mean, a judge had decided that that was the only way Poe could responsibly uh, be held to justice here. He had to either pay the amount of money that he owed people, or he had to come into court and plead nonage, which is to say, declare that he was a minor. And technically, in Virginia at that time, at least according to the uh, legal announcements that were appearing in the Richmond Enquirer, the legal age in terms of wills was 21. So Poe was not yet 21. He was, when he left in 1827, he had just turned 18. So, I mean, this is a guy who is basically going out into the wide world with nothing. And except that he did manage to smuggle out of the house. He got a slave to go back to the house and pack up his things in a little trunk and bring them to him because John Allen wouldn't let him have that stuff.
Well, and so
Uh,
so you amassed all of these debts, and so we're kind of glossing over the UVA period. What,
yeah,
how did he conduct him? So we jump from, boy in the British Museum to he's in wild debt, making up a fake name. So what does he do when he goes to college?
well, you mentioned earlier that Allen was wealthy, and in fact he did become wealthy in 1825 when John Allen's uncle William Galt finally died and left John Allen uh, a massive amount of money. I mean, roughly $300,000, which uh, in today's terms, you could multiply that by 30. So 9 million or something like that. Uh, and he also received, I think, three different estates that John Allen owned with all of the equipment, the slaves, the animals, whatever. So Allen was terrifically wealthy by the end of March 1825, and he decided that he would send Poe to the University of Virginia. And of course, the Richmond papers had been following all of the stories about Thomas Jefferson sending a man to Europe to find his professors and wanting to create this model institution uh, based on advanced principles of learning, an Enlightenment school. Uh, it was controversial because it was almost the only university in the United States at that time that was not church related. In fact, there was not even a chapel on the UVA campus, which scandalized some of the ministers in Richmond. But Jefferson had great support from the House of Delegates, and he was able to make this happen. Poe went there at the beginning of 1826, and of course, it's easy to see from notices in the Richmond papers of estimated costs for the year that John Allan set Poe up for a nightmare. He sent him off to school with not enough money to even pay his fees on the first day. So Poe was almost immediately plunged into, a very sad business of trying to beg some money from people he knew, trying to get credit from merchants, and then ultimately going to, loan sharks to get some money at a terrible interest rates, just to buy textbooks, put clothes on his back, buy blankets for his room, buy candles so that he could read at night. The money that Allan provided Poe put in his hand when he sent him off was far short of what he needed.
So this kind of sets him up really for a lifetime struggle just for existence, which because
Yeah,
as he goes and tries to make his way as an author, being an author is not easy, and especially in the 1830s and 40s.
right.
So he amasses all of these debts at UVA, has a falling out with John Allan basically for failing at an impossible task.
Right.
And now it's time for Poe to go and start this new life. And so where does he go? What does he do out of Virginia?
Well, his first stop was Boston. Um, he probably went there because that's where he was born. And that's where his parents were very well known as, theatrical performers. Um, they had been long dead. And in fact, I don't think Poe ever ran into anybody in Boston who remembered his parents as actors. I mean, maybe he did, but um, and instead, what he did was to take this little folio or sheaf of poems that he had been working on, and I think working on since he got back from England, where he was badly bitten by the bug of romantic poetry. Uh, he was a total Byron fan. uh, and many of his early poems are kind of Byron knockoffs. And Poe took these poems to Boston and thought that if he could get them published, he might suddenly become famous. Well, it didn't work out very well. The only publisher he could find was this pretty inexperienced guy named Calvin Thomas, who ran a print shop and printed little circulars for merchants and labels for pharmaceuticals. And it's not clear that he had any experience at all in book publishing. And there's one article that talks about all of the there are many typographical errors in Poe's first book of poetry, but there are also some really ugly mistakes in the way the different parts of the book were assembled. They don't quite fit together. And so when Poe's book came out, it created no noise at all. And Poe realized that he was not going to get rich as a poet, couldn't even keep himself alive. So he joined the army, and he went off to spend the next 5 months in Boston Harbor on Castle Island, which is just off the shore of South Boston, or it was then. South Boston has now extended out so that you can actually drive from South Boston onto what used to be Castle Island. Um, anyway, that's where Poe spent the next 5 months. He had joined the artillery and he quickly became a clerk and spent the next, couple of years in the army. He signed up for 5 years, but by the end of 1828, he already realized, no way, I'm going to make it 5 years with this life. Uh, and so he talked to his lieutenant, who counseled him to get John Allen's permission to leave the army so that he could seek an appointment at West Point. Poe was, very conscious of the difference between officers and enlisted men. He was made a sergeant major in his regiment, which is the highest rank an enlisted man could reach at that time. So he was over 400 guys in his regiment by the time he got out of the army.
Which suggests that when he put his mind to it, he was competent, at least at administrative type tasks.
He was absolutely. He was very resourceful and reliable and smart, quick. He could pick things up, and he had the sense not to get in the face of his commanding officers. Uh, I think he was a fairly mild-mannered guy at that time. Um, but anyway, Poe then went down to South Carolina, where he served at Fort Moultrie from late November of 1827 until December of 1828, when his unit was transferred up to Fortress Monroe in Virginia. That is around Hampton Roads, that area. And Poe had been promoted to being an artificer in South Carolina, which means he's the guy that puts the cannonballs together and makes them bombs as bombs bursting in air. Poe literally put the gunpowder into those hollow cannonballs and then figured out how long the fuse had to be if this was going to be a 20-second trajectory or a 30-second trajectory. And so he had to sort all of that stuff out. And he took care of the magazine and the munitions and so forth. And then he was eventually promoted to sergeant major. So yeah, but Poe realized that, the Army is can be an interesting life, but mostly if you're an officer, it's a
Which is funny because his relatively rapid promotion and success as an enlisted man compared to he's going to head off to West Point and
yeah.
have a very different experience. So why don't you tell us about how West Point goes for him?
Well, by the way, I should mention that there's a new Netflix movie called The Pale Blue Eye that portray, it's completely fictional, but it's actually, I think, an interesting film that sort of evokes Poe's temperament and the period and West Point, which I think was used for the shooting. Maybe I'm wrong there, but
No, it was. I watched it. I sometimes historical fiction rubs me the wrong way, but it was. I enjoyed it a lot, so I would
yeah,
agree.
yeah. So anyway, Poe pulled a lot of strings to get himself admitted to West Point. And of course, his admission was signed by Andrew Jackson, uh, which is, a kind of delicious irony when you think about how much Poe hated Jackson. But uh, um, he here's one thing about Poe that a lot of people don't understand, and it's really something about the United States at that time that is also hard to metabolize, and that is that the country was so much smaller then than it is now, and that it was everybody knew people whose names were in newspapers and who were movers and shakers. I'll give you a for instance. The church that Poe went to with his mother in Richmond, and there's a wonderful story connected with that church that has never been included in Poe biography. He attended the monumental church in Richmond, which was built on the site of the terrible Richmond theater fire of December 26th, 1811, in which 72 people died, including the governor of Virginia. The church was built literally on the ruins of the theater with the remains of the 72 people in the catacombs, the vaults beneath the church. And the entire church is filled with symbolism that recalls its tragic origins. Lacrimal vases, Egyptian vases filled with tears, shrouds, falling stars, all of this symbolism. And this is what Poe looked at every Sunday when he went to church and listened to one of the most powerful. If Richard Channing Moore had lived in the 20th or 21st century, he would have been a televangelist. But he was actually the bishop of the Episcopal Church of Virginia, and he was a dynamic presence. Some of the members of that church were Chief Justice John Marshall and Attorney General William Wirt. And those were two people that Poe knew he could count on for recommendations to West Point. Another family friend was Winfield Scott, the general who a few years later would drive the Cherokees out of North Carolina and Georgia along the Trail of Tears. In fact, a sort of a delicious irony here is that those Cherokees who were fighting to hold on to their land went to the Supreme Court, to John Marshall's Supreme Court, to sue the state of Georgia for its encroachments on tribal territory. And they got as their lawyer William Wirt.
Right. And we
And
often use the decision in that one as a primary source in the high school classroom. But of course, we never get into the fact that pretty much three parties to this conversation all went to the same church. So,
yeah, no, and that's one of those little fun facts about Poe that has just never really figured in a biography
well,
before,
and
but
the
it
theater
will in
fire,
mine.
the theater fire incident reminds me a little bit of Hop Frog when we get down the road to that.
Oh,
Um,
absolutely,
and
absolutely.
and
And
so
in fact,
go
yeah,
ahead.
go ahead.
So I'm thinking maybe so we can be respectful of your time as we kind of cruise into the last half hour here. We can move into just as a synopsis, Poe goes to West Point. The life's not for him, and
Yeah,
he gets out by
right,
flunking out and
right.
court-martialed. But so in the sort of his mature stage, which isn't that long since he died at 40, uh, I kind of want us to move into him trying to be a professional writer, working as an editor, working in journalism, and then of course his interesting marriage.
Yeah.
And so
Okay,
what
I will do my best to be concise here. I think I know what. Uh, okay, so when Poe left West Point and he was court-martialed, He got himself court-martialed deliberately because he knew that without an inheritance from John Allan, he did not have the means to live the life of an officer. This is something that has, you know, gone out of anyone's perspective, but unless you had, private money, family money, you really couldn't think about becoming an Army officer because there was so much the Army didn't pay for that you had to provide yourself. And so Poe just deliberately, went off the rails at West Point, didn't attend classes, didn't go to chapel, um, didn't show up for reviews. Um, there's a story that he showed up uh, wearing only his cross belt, nothing else, for parade review. uh, so when he left West Point, he went off to New York and published his third volume of poetry, thanks to all the money that he had pulled together from the cadets. And he thanked them in the preface. Uh, but Poe realized that he was not going to make a career as a poet. So from New York, where he stayed for a few months after his dismissal, he moved to Baltimore and began living as he had briefly in 1829 with his grandmother and his aunt. His aunt had a daughter, Virginia, who was, at that time quite young. Uh, and she was, sort of a little companion for Poe, uh, who finally realized that the only way he could really make a career for himself was to do what William Gilmore Simms had done in South Carolina. This is one of the things I was working on today, reading the Charleston Courier and Mercury, and discovering that in the summer of 1828, William Gilmore Simms was launching the Southern Literary Gazette with a partner and was going to create a quality monthly magazine that would feature a whole lot of work by William Gilmore Simms. He provided a model for Poe for how to do it. Okay, Simms had been a poet, but that wasn't paying off either. So Simms realized he had to do other things, and one of them was publish a magazine. This is what Poe started to point toward. And in 1832, he started writing tales. He figured that was the gold mine. All of these new periodicals that were popping up all over the country in the 1820s and 30s, whether they were weeklies or monthlies or quarterlies, most of them featured fiction and poetry, sometimes, essays and reviews, but the tale was the product that Poe was really interested in producing. And during those years in Baltimore, he wrote a lot of, junky little satires that I wouldn't, I would say, if you're looking for great Poe, that's not where to go. But Manuscript Found in a Bottle and The Assignation were two very interesting tales to come out of those early years. And by 1835, with the help of a Baltimore novelist named John Pendleton Kennedy, and I could give you a sidebar on him, but y'all go out and do that. John Pendleton Kennedy was a wealthy man, a lawyer, who gave Poe a lot of help about that time. And he put him in touch with Thomas White, who was starting a journal in Richmond, the Southern Literary Messenger. So by August of 35, Poe was offered a job and went off to Richmond by himself where he was promptly miserable. In fact, Poe had a kind of crisis, maybe a suicidal crisis. Uh, he had left behind his aunt, uh, Mrs. Clem, and Virginia. And he wrote a begging letter to Mrs. Clem to join him in Richmond. And of course, to bring dear little Virginia. He refers to her as his his sister, his wifey. a little,
So
a little,
let's get into that while we're here, and then we could return mostly to sort of his literary work. Um, so obviously, a lot of conversation surrounds his relationship with
yeah,
Virginia, their marriage, what the nature of it was.
yeah.
Um, just what's your take on that relationship and then that marriage?
Well, this has been a hot topic in Poe studies for a long time,
Right.
and the reality is we just don't know because we weren't there, and Poe didn't write about it, and nobody who knew about it wrote about it. Um, but there are some hints in tales here and there, and my take is that uh, Poe married Virginia uh, in a civil marriage before they came down to Richmond, I think just for the sake of form. And then he married her in a church in May of 1836 for appearance. Uh, and um, I I have a hard time imagining that then Poe was much attracted to Virginia. She was slow developing and really retained the manner of a schoolgirl, for a while. Um, but at a certain point, having lived together in, close physical proximity for a good while, they apparently did enter into a conjugal relationship. And the best evidence for that, and it's certainly not compelling, but it's evidence, is the tale Eleonora. Poe wrote a whole string of stories about dying women, famously, and later would argue in his philosophy of composition, explaining how he wrote The Raven, that the death of a beautiful woman is the most poetic of all subjects. Who knew? Uh, in the mid 1830s, Poe started a string of stories about dying women. Morella, Ligeia, The Fall of the House of Usher, and then we get to Eleonora. And Eleonora is the only one of those stories that has a somewhat happy ending. And it's a story that I think clearly implies that at a certain point, Poe and Virginia felt that their relationship had been had fallen under the influence of Eros. He uses the word Eros, and
And that says a lot for a literary man. So
yeah, and even the flowers get more colorful. Uh,
well, it's so and tragically she dies early as well from
she does.
tuberculosis.
She does.
Uh,
Um, so Poe lasted about a year and a half with the Southern Literary Messenger, had a falling out with Thomas White, and moved to New York. And of course, this was in 1837, which you're in history. You know the phrase that we associate with 1837, the panic of. And it was a terrible, terrible time to go anywhere. And New York was filled with bread lines and, terrible starvation and hunger. And Poe had no job at all, and probably got by simply because Mrs. Clem would do laundry or take in mending for people, did little projects like that that brought in a few coins. By 1838, Poe and his little family moved on to Philadelphia. And there, Poe's career really took off. He actually, I think one of the great breakthrough stories for Poe was the story Ligeia, which he published in the fall of 1838 in a Baltimore periodical. This is a really great story in lots of ways, and I think it sort of combines Poe's preoccupation with death with what he came to see as the injustice of death, because the character Ligeia is a woman of titanic will who refuses to die, and said that implied that she would do anything she could to come back. Well, it's a story of metempsychosis, and there are pretty clear signals that even though Poe's narrator leaves Germany and goes to England and marries a woman who is everything different from Ligeia, who was dark-haired, dark-eyed, that we begin to feel the presence of Ligeia in that remote abbey that he fills up with funereal decor right out of the British Museum. And that was a story that really propelled Poe. He got a job with William Burton, the Gentleman's Magazine, and in 1839 produced a string of great works. That, The Fall of the House of Usher and William Wilson are the two principal tales there. But Poe continued to work for Burton through the middle of 1840, when they had a terrific falling out, and Poe quit. He started writing then for George Graham, who bought out Burton's magazine, merged it with The Casket to create this new lavish popular magazine called Graham's Magazine, with the most spectacular illustrations of any journal in America, and sort of vying with Godey's Lady's Book, but the same kind of fashion illustrations. But Godey's was just top of the line all the way around. Poe started publishing there. He published The Man of the Crowd, a really, really first-rate story. And if you're looking for an interesting Poe story to read, that would be a great one to go to. It's a great analysis of the alienation of urban life in the early 19th century. It's set in London, but it's also an absolutely fascinating study of self-delusion and blindness, because the narrator is convinced that he's on the path of a psychopath. He decides this guy is the type and genius of deep crime. He refuses to be alone. He never once considers the possibility that this bizarre character is aware that he's being stalked. Just doesn't cross his mind. So it's it's a brilliant tale that conceals its nature from the reader. And I can't tell you, how many studies are just entirely focused on that stranger and completely miss the self-delusion of the narrator who thinks he is, the prototype of the great detective. And of course, this led to Poe's detective tales, which all appeared in Philadelphia, beginning with the Murders in the Rue Morgue in 1841, The Mystery of Marie Roget, and then finally in 1844, The Purloined Letter. Poe was working on so many things at this time. It was a very productive period for him, but also a desperate period because in 1842 he became aware that Virginia had tuberculosis. And two tales to look at that were written in very close proximity to that discovery, which happened when she was playing the piano and singing, when suddenly she had a massive pulmonary hemorrhage. That couldn't have been great to look at.
No.
I mean, yeah. So the two works that were written in close proximity, one seems like a fairly obvious spinoff, The Mask of the Red Death, but the other one is The Black Cat, which leads us to this horrific Freudian act in which the narrator buries an axe in the brain of his wife. And it reminds us that along with grief, anger is almost always present. So Poe, tries to keep his career going, even though he's distracted and he starts drinking again. He goes to Washington in one of the strangest episodes of his career to try to persuade the president of the United States to give him a job in some kind of government job, just anywhere. I'll do anything. He's got a good literary friend named Frederick Thomas, who has already parlayed his support of William Henry Harrison into a government job. And Poe thinks he can do the same thing with Tyler because, hey, Tyler's from Virginia. And he knows Tyler's son has corresponded with him and actually goes down to have a little session with Robert Tyler to see if he can chat him up and get his father to put him in a job, make a place for him. And Poe is madly proposing some kind of magazine that he'll even edit that sort of promotes the career of John Tyler, who, as you know, was pretty much a man without a party at that point.
Not a good horse to back.
Yeah, he had jumped from the Democrats to become Harrison's running mate, and then wound up in the White House, where he was disliked by Whigs and Democrats. And so Poe was trying to take care of that. It's another one of those strange convergences of notables in the life of Edgar Poe. He went to Washington and just got falling down drunk. He made a complete spectacle of himself. Fortunately, he had some friends there who grabbed him and took care of him, put him in a hotel room, and finally sent him back to Philadelphia. But Poe not only did not get a job with the Tyler administration, the news of that debacle got back to this guy in Philadelphia who was about to provide financial help for a monthly journal that Poe wanted to start. The guy was a temperance advocate, and this was a no-go. This was a no-go. So Poe
So
had a wonderful gift for shooting himself in the foot.
he sure does, and he's that's why he's in many ways such a tragic figure, which I guess is one reason he was really good at making literary art. As we kind of come to sort of the last 10 minutes, so I can keep within our bounds here,
Okay.
I want to ask you two things. One dealing with sort of closing out his biography, and the other on his work. Um, so obviously, his wife dies, things kind of spiral, and then he dies very suddenly in
Yeah.
Baltimore in 1849. And how and why he died is, kind of a long-standing conundrum. And so, what is your take on what happened?
Well, that compresses a lot of,
It does, and I hate to do that.
yeah. Well, I mean, the long and short of it is that's another one of those mysteries that really can't be solved. Certainly, Poe had tuberculosis. He had been ill already at the time of Virginia's death in 1847. Whether he had a recurrence then, I don't know. He had recently taken the pledge and tried to give up drinking without any success. And then when he arrived in Baltimore on his way back to New York, um, in one sense, he should have been a happy camper because he had just been in Richmond and had persuaded the woman he was in love with when he went off to Charlottesville, who was now a wealthy widow, to marry him and to support his literary projects, including founding a prestigious monthly magazine. That was the great compelling dream of Poe's later life. And so he arrived in Baltimore on what apparently was an election day. And because they didn't have computers or even very accurate records of who voted or who could vote, it was popular uh, among political operatives to hang out around polling places and to grab people off the street and take them into a bar and buy them a couple of drinks and then lead them back to the polling place and tell them who to vote for. I mean, that has led to a lot of, you know, assumptions that Poe was a victim of this nefarious process that was then called cooping. You coop somebody up. It's like hot boxing. Uh, he was grabbed off the street and plied with more drink than he could possibly handle. Now there are many other theories of, what killed Poe, and I think one very plausible explanation is that it created a cerebral hemorrhage, and that in the same way that an LSU fraternity pledge a few years ago was made to drink to the point where his brain literally could not function. And when that happens, you that automatic process of the brain telling the heart to beat, that goes away, and or breathe. And so Poe lasted a few days, and then he died. There are all kinds of theories. One theory holds that he spent too much time in gaslit parlors and basically was poisoned by the lighting of that era. Um, Another theory was that on the way down south, he had stopped in Philadelphia and actually spent a night in Moyamensing prison and was bitten by a rat and got rabies. Well, maybe rabies, but you
The
know,
alcohol sounds more plausible to me with his track
well,
record.
yeah, and yet the doctor attending him swore that Poe was not drunk when he was brought in,
Right.
which is yeah. And now the doctor who attended him also had his own agenda because he wanted to sanitize Poe so that he could write a book, uh, and he did. Dr. John Moran, an account of the last days of Edgar Poe.
So,
Um, so, Poe's life was very short. He was never hugely popular. Uh, the most popular works he ever wrote were The Gold Bug in 1843, his treasure hunt tale set on Sullivan's Island in South Carolina. You don't ever forget that stuff. You just use it in the stories you write later. And then his greatest poem, The Raven, uh, which created an absolute hit in January 1845, was reprinted all over the place, inspired dozens and dozens of parodies uh, or homage, uh, and I think represents in many ways sort of the perfect distillation of the dilemma that I began talking about, of Poe confronting the problem of death, the death of this woman he's in love with. And the one thing he most wants to understand is whether there is a heaven, whether there is a life after life where he will embrace Lenore. And of course, we know the Raven's answer. Uh, and there's a certain perverseness about that poem. Uh, but by this time, the guy knows what the bird's going to say. So he keeps asking these questions that are going to drive a stake in his heart. Uh, and yet it's really at the crux of this paradox in Poe, where there is a, a, a kind of classic disbelief. Um, Sarah Helen Whitman said, the unrest and faithlessness of the age culminated in him. He gazed into the abyss. And yet there is in Poe this persistent thing, this longing to know, the longing for some kind of affirmation, the longing for some hope that he can hang on to. So to me, the poem is striking not just because he's asking a series of questions that are incredibly painful. It's that he continues to ask questions. He wants another answer. He wants another answer. There's got to be an answer for this thing we call death.
oh,
So,
Jerry, that's you beat me to the punch where I was going to ask you to talk about, sort of a closing work of interest that you might recommend, and you sold it beautifully. And I think that puts a bow on a really, interest. You did it well, is what I would say. And I
thank
for
you.
the time we have here, I've learned a huge amount really in this discussion. I knew the outline, but all the intricate details and especially the literary analysis has been awesome. And while I'm going to post some of your books in the description, the current book project you're working on, sort of in closing, do you have a projected title for that?
Yeah, I do. Uh, uh,
You don't have to share it if you don't want to, but
well, I actually signed a contract for this book uh, about a month ago with Norton,
okay,
W. W. Norton, and it'll be a trade book. This is not an academic. This is
good.
not going to be a, kind of a definitive scholarly work. I'm trying to write the most interesting book on Poe that I can write that will make people absolutely run to get some Poe to read. And I'm telling a story about Poe and about the world he lived in. And yeah, so the title that I hope I'm going to be still liking okay is called The Brazen Quest of Edgar A. Poe.
Nice.
And it's I mean, it's not just for one thing. Uh, Poe was certainly desperate to find a mother who would love him, desperate for a home where he was not rejected and driven out. Um, he was uh, he was driven to achieve eminence in the Republic of Letters, absolutely consumed by that idea. He wanted to publish the most distinguished monthly magazine in America. And he wanted to find an answer to this imponderable problem that leads him through a series of works. And I'll mention a couple that I didn't mention before. One of them is uh, the conversation of Eros and Carmen. There's another one called The Colloquy of Monos and Una. These are not big hits in Poe studies. The Power of Words, and then Mesmeric Revelation. These are all attempts to conceptualize the spirit world, the destination of the soul. And it represents that side of Poe that is, kind of pitted against his cynical, empirical, scientific, rational um, habit of doubting, glib theology. And that was an intractable conflict in Poe that continued throughout his life. You see it, I mean, if you just take a look at Eureka, an incredibly ambitious, perplexing work that is trying to understand the relationship between the creator of the universe and this puny sack of body and blood, skin and bones that we inhabit. Is there any connection? That's what Poe wanted to figure out.
And that was his brazen quest.
It
Oh,
was.
that's awesome. It reminds me a lot of William James. I mean, much later in the 19th century, obviously. But well, I've loved this interview, Jerry. I really have. And it's been great getting into the life and the work of Poe. And honestly, whenever the book comes out, I look forward to reading it and also maybe talking about it someday. But for this episode, thank you, Jerry. Thank you, everybody, for listening. And as always, have a good one.